There is a moment, and you may have already felt it, when someone who gave you more than you knew how to receive becomes quietly, completely unreachable. Not because they left, not because they made a declaration, they are still there, still present, still responding technically to the surface of the interaction, but something that was there before is no longer there. The warmth has not turned cold exactly, it has turned still. And you realize, with a particular kind of slow unease, that the person, who once seemed to have an inexhaustible supply of patience and attunement, has simply stopped. The explanations have stopped, the follow-up messages, the effort to close the gaps that were always being quietly closed before you noticed them opening. The willingness to revisit, to clarify, to make sure that understanding had actually happened between you, all of it without announcement, without ultimatum, without the confrontation you would have known how to respond to gone. And what replaces it is not the theatrical silence of punishment. It is something far more disquieting than that. It is the calm of a person who has already completed the process you thought hadn't started yet. Most people encountering this reach for the most available explanation. They call it the silent treatment. They assume a strategy that someone who felt everything decided to weaponize their absence, that the withdrawal is a calculated move designed to produce a specific outcome. And operating from that assumption, they do exactly the wrong thing. They chase, they pressure. They argue against what they believe to be a negotiating position, not understanding that they are solving a problem that does not exist. The empath's silence is not a strategy. It is what happens when the most sensitive nervous system in the room reaches the only conclusion its accumulated experience will allow. Affective neuroscience, the documented study of how emotional experience is processed in the brain, has produced a specific and often ignored understanding of highly empathic individuals. The anterior cingulate cortex, which activates during both physical pain and social rejection, does not cleanly distinguish between the two categories. Research on individuals with heightened empathic sensitivity consistently shows elevated activation in this region during social pain events. The empath is not experiencing your dismissal as a metaphor. They are experiencing it as a physiological event, one the body registers with the same cellular language it uses for physical threat. And the body, when a source of sustained cost is present for long enough, does what it always does. It adapts. But here is what almost no one explains. The adaptation does not begin with silence. Silence is the final chapter of a story that was written across months, sometimes years, in the background of every conversation you thought was ordinary. To understand what the silence actually represents, you need to understand what was happening inside the empath long before it arrived. The empath's first response to damage is never distance, it is accommodation. Their nervous system is architecturally wired to register the complexity behind behavior, the invisible pressures and histories shaping what another person does in a given moment. They extend benefit of the doubt not as a policy but as a reflex. They absorb not just what you did but why you might have done it. They hold your worst moments inside a framework that includes your best ones. And because this capacity is so deep, the early damage does not read as damage, it reads as the ordinary cost of caring in proximity to another human being. Here is where the empath's experience diverges most sharply from the experience of someone who does not process the world this way. The person without heightened empathic sensitivity can miss a moment of disconnection and not carry it forward. They can file it as a minor event or not file it at all. For the empath, this is not the available option. Every moment of real emotional content registers with the same involuntary precision that makes them, in the good stretches of any relationship, such an extraordinary presence. The sensitivity does not switch off when the moment is uncomfortable. It continues to receive. It continues to process. What this means in practice is that the empath is often carrying a more detailed record of the relationship, its patterns of connection, its ruptures, its repairs, the consistency of reciprocity and the consistency of its absence than anyone else in the dynamic has access to, not because they are keeping score, because they cannot not notice. The relationship's emotional landscape is mapped with the granularity that comes from years of involuntary, automatic attention. Every pattern is documented. The times when you showed up and the times you didn't. The moments of genuine meeting and the moments when the surface held but the depth didn't. The promises that were kept and the promises that were not made explicitly but were implied by the nature of what was being asked. None of this is filed as accusation. It is simply received, processed, and integrated into an increasingly accurate model of what this relationship actually is, as opposed to what both people have agreed, in the shorthand of ongoing intimacy, to call it. The moment of genuine disclosure received with distraction that was a difficult week. The expressed need that was quietly redirected toward what you needed instead that was not the right time. The communication of pain met with logic or minimization, or the swift and efficient pivot to something else entirely that was a misunderstanding. Each of these moments, the empath explains to themselves in language that preserves the relationship, because the relationship is something they feel, and what they feel, they protect. This is not naivety. This is not avoidance. This is an empathic mind doing exactly what it was built to do, finding the most generous possible interpretation and holding it. Because something in the empath genuinely cannot fully accept that a person they love is consistently, structurally unable to meet them. But the anterior cingulate cortex does not accept those explanations. It simply notes what happened, and it files it. Researchers who study the intersection of emotional regulation and chronic stress have documented a concept sometimes described as the window of tolerance, the range of physiological arousal within which a nervous system can function, process, and respond without flooding or shutting down. For highly empathic individuals, this window is often wider than for the general population. Their system can accommodate more emotional complexity, more interpersonal friction, more inconsistency without dysregulating. This is part of why the empath can seem, in the early stages of any relationship dynamic, almost impervious to damage. They hold more. They return to equilibrium faster. What narrows the window is not acute conflict. Acute conflict can often be processed cleanly, it produces a response, the response resolves, and the nervous system returns to baseline. What narrows the window over time, with the quiet persistence of erosion, is something subtler, the repeated experience of offering genuine emotional presence and receiving inadequate acknowledgement. Not rejection, not cruelty, inadequacy. The moment of real vulnerability received with partial attention, the authentic offering that was moved past as though it hadn't been significant. Each of these instances, individually, is dismissible. Accumulated across months and years, they are not dismissible. They are cumulative stress on a system that has been logging everyone not consciously, not in a list of grievances, but in the ongoing and automatic way that sensitive nervous systems track their environment. What makes this particularly important to understand is that the empath is often the last person in the relationship to consciously name what the accumulation is doing. They are so skilled at the generous interpretation, so practiced at absorbing and releasing rather than holding, that they can be genuinely surprised when the model completes. The silence, when it arrives, comes as something of a surprise even to the person whose nervous system produced it. There is usually a period between the model completing and the silence becoming observable. The empath continues to function inside the relationship. They continue to show up, to respond, to be present, but something has shifted at the level of investment. The full, unrestricted offering of themselves, the thing that made the empath's presence so distinct, so sustaining for the people around them, has been, without announcement, partially withdrawn. They are still giving, but they are no longer giving everything. And the reduction is not a choice they make in the morning and act out during the day. It is the nervous system's natural response to the depletion calculation. Give less, while the threat model is being confirmed or disconfirmed by new data. The empath in this period will often describe themselves as simply being tired. They are not tired in the general sense. They are tired in the specific sense of having spent more than they received for longer than they should have had to sustain. The prefrontal cortex operates on a longer timeline than the emotional response regions. It does not react. It accumulates. It pattern matches. And what it builds, across the repeated experience of genuine emotional labor offered without equivalent recognition, is a threat model. Not a threat of cruelty necessarily, something more precise than that. A model of this particular environment as one in which sustained openness results in net depletion. where the investment of authentic empathic presence consistently costs more than it returns, where one nervous system is continuously working, monitoring, absorbing, processing, repairing, while the other remains, in some essential way, unburdened. When that model completes, not with a dramatic realization, but with something closer to a quiet internal certainty, the prefrontal cortex does what it was designed to do. It begins to regulate. It installs a new operating condition. Proximity without protection is no longer viable. The empath did not decide to go silent. The empath's brain chose survival. And here is the part that makes this almost impossible to navigate from the outside. The silence, when it finally arrives, doesn't look like a shutdown. There is no rupture, no scene, no verdict delivered. The empath becomes, to all external observation, fine, calmer than before, less emotionally volatile. And to the person who is the accumulated source of the cost, this calm will read, at first, as stabilization, as proof that the difficult period has resolved. It has not resolved. It has concluded. What you are observing is the empath functioning inside a new internal architecture, one in which the automatic empathic response to you has been placed behind a layer of regulation. They can still read your emotional state with the same precision they always had. They still know when you're anxious. They still catch the shift in your voice, the weight behind a word chosen too carefully, the absence you're trying to paper over with ordinary conversation. Nothing about their perceptual capacity has diminished, but between that perception and the response that once came automatically, there is now a question that wasn't there before. Is this safe? And for a period whose length depends entirely on the history that produced the question, the answer quietly, without announcement, is no. This behavioral shift is subtle enough that most people around the empath do not immediately register what it represents. The empath still shows up, still participates. In some settings, they might even seem more relaxed than before, because the vigilance that was consuming enormous background processing has reduced. They are no longer continuously monitoring for the next moment that will need to be absorbed and managed. They are no longer running the background calculation of how to respond to your emotional state in a way that protects both of you while costing only one. They are present. They are simply no longer carrying the relationship on their back while pretending the weight doesn't exist. The particular quality of the empath's silence that makes it so difficult to address is this. It requires no maintenance. The anger of someone withdrawing in retaliation is exhausting to sustain. It signals itself through tension and curt responses and the visible performance of injury. The empath's silence requires none of that. It is simply the absence of the continuous effort that was once present. There is nothing to maintain because there is nothing being performed. And that absence, the withdrawal of the active, invested, effortful attunement that was once the background condition of the relationship feels, from the outside, like nothing at all, until you suddenly realize that everything that was happening is no longer happening. This is the moment people watching from outside most consistently misread. They see disengagement and respond with pressure demanding the access that was once freely given, not understanding that the demand confirms the nervous system's threat assessment. Or they perform, becoming visibly attentive in the high-stakes moments of confrontation and repair, not understanding that the empath's nervous system distinguishes between performance under observation and pattern across ordinary time. Or they withdraw in kind, interpreting the empath's calm as indifference and matching it with their own. This last response, of all available ones, most efficiently completes the distance the empath's nervous system was already prepared to accept. None of these responses address what actually happened. None of them address the record, because the silence is not a behavior. The silence is documentation. It is the record of every moment of genuine presence offered without equivalent return. Every time the empath felt the temperature of the relationship dropping and quietly warmed it before anyone noticed it had changed, every expression of vulnerability received with something less than it deserved, every instance in which the cost of the relationship was borne, consistently and without acknowledgement, by one person, while the other remained, in some essential way, comfortable. And you feel it, if you are paying attention, not as an event, but as a change in the texture of the relationship. Something ambient has shifted. The background warmth, the felt sense that someone was tracking you, attending to you, noticing the small things you never articulated has reduced. And because it was ambient, because it was the background condition of the relationship rather than a visible, named thing, you have no precise language for what you have lost. You know something is different. You cannot say in specific terms what the different thing is. This is one of the empath's most painful gifts. The thing they provide is often most clearly named only by its absence. The silence is all of that, finally set down. And this is where the most consequential misunderstanding of the empath's silence emerges. Because the most common response to recognizing it, even a genuine, authentic response, is an attempt to address it at the surface level. Apologies, demonstrations of having understood, the gestures that would have worked readily at a much earlier point in the process. And the empath will often respond to these gestures because they are still feeling, because the feeling still includes caring, because they are not constitutionally built for sustained coldness, but the response is different now. The neurological model built during the accumulation period does not disassemble because the surface behavior has improved. The prefrontal cortex's threat model does not clear on the basis of apologies expressed under the pressure of obvious distance. It clears on the basis of something far slower and far less dramatic. Evidence, in the ordinary moments, when there is nothing to prove and no observation to perform for, that the conditions which produce the threat have actually changed at the structural level. Not performed differently, changed. This is why many people find themselves in what might be the most disorienting position this dynamic produces. The empath is still there, still present. Even kinder, in some ways, because the silence removed the anxiety that was generating the conflict. But the depth of access is different. There is a door that was open and is now closed, with no visible lock, no stated condition for when it might reopen, no roadmap available from the outside. Just a calm, present, permanently, slightly unreachable version of someone who was once completely available. That door is not punishment. That door is the minimum viable distance a nervous system has calculated it requires to remain functional. And it will not open on your schedule. Here is the part about that door that is almost impossible to communicate to someone on the outside of it. If it does eventually begin to open, and sometimes it does, slowly and incompletely, the empath who opens it is not returning to who they were before. They are not extending the same unguarded access that existed before the accumulation began. What opens is different, something smaller, more deliberate, more conditional. Not conditional in the sense of a list of demands, conditional in the sense that the nervous system has learned something it cannot unlearn. It has learned the cost of openness in this particular context, and it applies that knowledge to every subsequent moment of deciding how much to offer. The door that opens is a door that was not there before the silence. It is a new door. Whether what comes through it can sustain what both people need from it, that is the question neither of them can answer in advance. Many people, faced with the slow and unglamorous work of generating the evidence that will actually change that threat model, not in the high-pressure confrontations, but in the quiet, unwitnessed, ordinary stretches of daily life, discover they cannot sustain the effort. And in discovering that, they reach for the available reframing. The empath's silence was manipulation. The withdrawal was unreasonable. The person who could not recover access had been, in some essential way, failed by someone who refused to repair things fairly. This reframing is understandable. It is also precisely the interpretation the empath's nervous system had already predicted was possible. Because what the empath's silence was documenting was not a list of grievances, it was documenting what was true about the relationship beneath the version both people were maintaining on the surface. The gap between the relationship that was described and the relationship that was lived. The gap that the empath had been quietly, consistently spanning with effort that was never adequately named or returned. And the silence is the moment that effort ended, not with an announcement, with the cessation of the quiet labor that had been keeping the gap invisible. The relationship, without that labor, became exactly as silent as it actually was. What almost no one focuses on is what happens to the empath on the other side of this. The attention goes to the impact on the relationship, on the other person, on the situation. The silence leaves unresolved. Almost no one asks what the silence produces inside the person who finally allowed it. The empath in silence is not dormant. The assumption from outside is that withdrawal equals stasis, that the person who went quiet is waiting in some suspended state for resolution. They are not waiting. They are processing. Not the acute processing of a crisis, but the slower and more fundamental work of a system that has been running at a deficit for a long time and is finally being given the space to do what it had been deferring. The nervous system that was continuously allocating resources to monitoring and managing an emotionally costly environment begins redirecting those resources. Gradually, as the sustained exposure to depletion ends, things that had contracted begin to expand. The creative capacity that had narrowed, the intellectual life that was compressed around the margins of the relationship, the attention to their own physical experience, the sleep, the body, the basic maintenance that was quietly deprioritized during the years of attending so carefully to someone else. The friendships at the periphery that received only whatever remained after the primary relationship had taken what it needed. These things return, and with their return, something in the empath clarifies. There is also a kind of grief inside the reorganization, not for the relationship necessarily, but for the years of themselves that were spent in that particular direction. For the version of themselves that was so certain the other person would eventually recognize what they were receiving, would eventually close the gap on their own. The empath grieves that certainty. The grief is real, but it does not consume the reorganization. It becomes part of it, part of the calibration that now knows in a cellular and permanent way what the costs of certain choices actually look like over time. And this grief for the version of themselves that stayed, that explained, that gave the benefit of the doubt past the point where it was serving anyone, turns out to be one of the most useful kinds of grief there is. It shows the empath, with a clarity that is only available in retrospect, exactly where the line between generosity and self-abandonment is. And having felt that line from both sides of it, they are unlikely to miss it again. They begin to understand with a precision they could not access while inside the depletion what their emotional presence is actually worth. Not in abstract terms, in the specific, concrete terms of what they were providing, at what consistency, over what period of time, and what they were receiving in return. This accounting is not grievance, it is calibration. And it produces permanently a different relationship to how they offer themselves going forward. The empath who comes through the silence is not a diminished version of who they were. What emerges in the documented patterns of recovery from sustained empathic overextension is someone with a higher resolution understanding of the specific conditions under which deep emotional presence is actually sustainable and a sharply reduced willingness to provide it in environments that cannot hold it. They feel with the same depth. What has changed is where that depth goes. They have become selective, not cold, not closed. Selective in the specific and accurate sense of the word, capable of distinguishing, at the level of their own nervous system, between the relationships that can hold what they bring and the ones that only consume it. The selectivity is not a closing. It is an accurate recognition, finally, completely accurate of what genuine reciprocity looks like and what it doesn't. This is what the silence was building toward, not permanent distance. The version of the empath that knows, with the quiet certainty that can only be built through loss, exactly what they are worth, and is no longer willing to offer that worth in exchange for its imitation. And now you have seen the mechanism. The silence was not the beginning of the end. It was the documentation that the end had already happened, quietly, in increments, in the nervous system of someone who felt everything and spent years choosing to protect you from the weight of it. The silence was that weight, finally, completely and without apology, set down. The question that remains, and it is the only question that actually matters here, is what you do with that understanding. The empath already moved forward. They moved forward the moment the silence became the most honest thing they had left to say. The decision still pending is yours. Whether you understand what was actually happening in the person who went quiet, and whether that understanding changes anything about where you go from here. If this landed somewhere it was supposed to land, if you recognized yourself on one side of this or the other, the comment section below is worth opening. Not to explain yourself, to find out how many people are reading the same words about their own life. And if you want to understand what the empath builds in the aftermath of the silence, and what that version of them means for every relationship they walk into from here, that is exactly where the next video begins.